Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. If you're in the East Coast of the United States, welcome to the webinar, Urban Power, Democracy and Inequality in São Paulo and Johannesburg. I am Bruno Carvalho. I'm a professor of Romance Languages and Literatures and African American Studies at Harvard, where I also co-direct the Harvard Mellon Urban Initiative. And I am very pleased to moderate this session on behalf of the Brazil Studies program at the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. This event is also co-sponsored by Harvard's Center for African Studies and the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. So today we will hear from Ben Bradlow, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the Weatherhead Scholars Program. His academic training is that of a true urbanist. Ben holds a PhD in sociology from Brown University, a master's in city planning from MIT, and a BA in history from Swarthmore. And today we'll hear about his book project. As a discussant, we are very lucky to have my colleague Alisha Holland, who's an associate professor of government. Alisha is the author of Forbearance as Redistribution, The Politics of Informal Welfare in Latin America, and she's now working on a book called Creative Construction, Rise and Stall of Mass Infrastructure in Latin America, which is the working title. So we are recording today's webinar. It will be available on the Dr. Class YouTube channel shortly after this session. In my role as moderator, I will be monitoring the Q&A tab. So please submit your questions during Ben's talk, after, whenever, and we will make sure to include it in the discussion after we hear from both Ben and Alisha. So without further ado, Ben.
All right. Thank you for the invitation to speak with you today. I've attended a number of seminars in this series over the past few years, and it's a real honor to speak with you today, and especially to be in conversation with Alisha and Bruno. Thank you for your willingness to engage with this work. This talk draws from my book manuscript, which is called Urban Power. And what I'm going to do is draw from my research in Sao Paulo and Johannesburg to argue for a set of conceptual tools to explain why some cities are more effective than others in reducing inequality. So when international media outlets have tried to depict inequality in South Africa and Brazil, which are two of the world's most unequal countries, they've often been drawn to the urban inequalities that are characteristic of each country's largest city. These are two of the cities that are responsible for the global explosion of city growth are Sao Paulo and Johannesburg, each of which are predicted to be among a group of 41 so-called megacities that are home to at least 10 million people in the next 10 years. On your left, you see a series from The Guardian. When they wanted to depict inequality in Sao Paulo, they chose a photo of a high-rise luxury apartment building in the eastern part of the city in Morumbi, next to the informal settlement of Paraisópolis. And then on the right, you see when Time magazine recently wanted to depict inequality in South Africa, they chose the suburb, the eastern suburb of Primrose near Johannesburg, next to the informal settlement of Makausi. And so I want to give you a bit of a sense of what these urban inequalities look like in these two cities. So each has a spatial form of a wealthy core and poor peripheries, which is associated with large inequities in the distribution of public goods. So these first maps are from Johannesburg, and in these maps, the dark red areas are all former townships that were almost exclusively home to Black residents during the apartheid era. I made these maps using data from the city's most recent census in 2011. In this first map, the red areas are places where over 20% of households are living in an informal shack. And then the darkest red areas in the second map are places where you have over 100 households using what's referred to in South Africa as the bucket system, where people put out their feces in a bucket to be collected. And then you see a similar kind of core periphery dynamic In Sao Paulo, this is just a map that shows in the most central areas, you have no people living informally or in an informal settlement. And then in the darkest orange areas, you're getting close to 70%. So while both cities are clearly very unequal and have both pursued policies to reduce inequality, they're not equally unequal. And increasingly, scholarship on inequality recognizes the fundamental importance of political choices to unequal outcomes. Beneath measures like income and wealth, the proximate determinants of economic inequality lie in the provision of public goods, which is often performed by local government. And my broader book project focuses on the distribution of three public goods: housing, sanitation, and transportation. But today I'm going to focus on housing. And each city has generated policies intended to reduce what are referred to as, quote, backlogs of housing demand, but they've done so in very different ways. So government subsidized housing projects in Johannesburg are delivered exclusively in the existing peripheries where apartheid once designated Black-only townships. These projects are all on undeveloped so-called greenfield land, and residents of informal settlements are subject to frequent evictions from both local government and private landowners. In contrast, in Sao Paulo, I'll describe a set of new policy tools that the city has used to reserve central urban land for housing projects, as well as to upgrade existing slums where they are what urban planners sometimes refer to as in situ upgrading. And one result of this is that the local government has ended all evictions. So the effects of these policies have also changed conditions within informal settlements because the provision of services like sanitation largely depends on housing and land use law. So I took these statistics from the first census after transitions to democracy and the most recent census in each city. Both cities have had informal settlement populations between 10 and 15% throughout this period, but the quality of life in these areas has diverged significantly. So one way to think about that is the share of households in informal settlements that have a flush toilet in the home. So in '96 in Johannesburg, this share was 36%, rising slightly by 2011 to 47%. In Sao Paulo, you actually began with a lower share of households in informal settlements with a toilet inside the house, 25%, almost tripling by 2011 to 68%. So compared to Johannesburg, Sao Paulo is clearly a positive case. There's also substantial literature among Brazilian researchers that's shown that improvements in Sao Paulo are particularly notable among a highly variable range of cities, even within Brazil. So the divergence between Joburg and Sao Paulo poses an empirical puzzle. Why are some cities more effective than others in reducing inequalities? And I was fascinated by these two cases because they had some key similarities in their transitions to democracy. South Africa transitioned in the early 90s and Brazil in the late 80s. And each of these transitions focused attention on the question of urban inequalities. In particular, there were three components to the social basis for the struggle for democracy in both countries. First, a new independent trade union federation. Second, neighborhood and citywide social movements focused on housing and basic services. And third, a political party of the left. So this alliance, which has been referred to as a, quote, social movement unionist alliance, led many observers to think that these countries might be able to overcome some of the deepest structural inequalities in any national context in the world. So remember, these are new democracies, and in older democracies like the US, constitutions are exclusively focused on civil and political rights. But the social movement unionist alliance in both Brazil and South Africa was heavily involved in negotiations over new constitutions. So it's no accident that these constitutions ended up with significant social and economic rights. The new constitutions of each country contain provisions that emphasize the role of urban inequalities and a new role for municipal governments in addressing these inequalities. So first, you see new rights to public goods like housing, sanitation, and transportation in both constitutions. And you also see provision for decentralized fiscal transfers and implementing authority allocated to local government. So this means that local government has both the fiscal capacity and the overall power to make it a meaningful place to analyze how well it changes the distribution of public goods. So what are ways to think about what we should expect to happen? The interdisciplinary urban literature more or less assumes that the political story is either driven by globalization and neoliberalism, or that it's driven by the programmatic orientation of more local property elites towards economic growth, and a literature that's more traditionally focused on the politics of redistribution, which is effectively a literature on social democracy at the national level, has focused on the role of democracy in empowering coalitions of working class movements and political parties of the left, as well as the internal organization of working class movements as determinants of redistributive success. So while the urban literature would predict deepening inequalities in both cases, the social movement unionist histories of both countries would predict reduced inequalities in these cases. And something that's notable about these approaches is that they're either theories of macro level structure or of how social forces align to produce governing regimes aimed at changing inequality. And what's largely missing is an institutional dimension in these theories of the politics of reducing inequality. And it's the institutional level that mediates the core relational conflict of cities between elites, particularly those with an investment in the property regime of the city, and the informalized unhoused poor. So in order to understand the relationship between these institutional histories and the divergence and inequality between Sao Paulo and Johannesburg, I conducted 16 months of field work across both cities, largely comprised of 240 interviews with all of the actors who have an interest in conflicts over these three policy arenas of housing, sanitation, and collective transportation. And I supplemented that with a range of archival work. And after my research in the field, what I found is that two factors explain when and why the local state is capable of changing the distribution of public goods in the city. The first is a local state embedded in civil society, and in particular in housing movements. And I define embeddedness as the ties of the local state to civil society that produce the ideas and space within bureaucratic agencies for redistributive policy change. So to illustrate, I was asking things like, do mid-level bureaucrats regularly interact with movements demanding things that they're supposed to be working on? Are there movements acting even within the bureaucracy itself? And then the second factor is what I call cohesive institutions. And I define cohesion as a coordinating capacity of the local state to implement policy changes. Now, municipal government is distinctive because it's a delegated scale that's regulated through a national institutional framework. So cohesion captures the distinct dimensions of coordinating delegated authority. There are two such dimensions: a horizontal dimension, which is coordinating across line agencies within the city, and a vertical dimension, which is coordinating across scales, local, state, and provincial, and national government. And here I'm looking to find evidence of policies, reforms, and circulation of bureaucrats that directly address the coordination of delivery of public goods. So this is how we can think about the argument in a 2x2 table. And remember, what I'm concerned with here is explaining the institutional reforms that correlate to material outcomes in the distribution of public goods. So in the ideal type of low embeddedness and low cohesion, I refer to this as a rentier regime, characterized by narrow elite capture. When you have high embeddedness and low cohesion, I call this a mobilizational regime, in which you have policies oriented towards redistribution, but lacking the financial and administrative capacity to implement them. When you have low embeddedness and high cohesion, I call this a managerial regime, which is characterized by programmatic top-down administration, generally oriented towards economic growth. And then you have that elusive combination of high embeddedness and high cohesion, which I call an integrationist regime, in which you have effective administration of redistribution-oriented policies. So I want to get into the cases now to to show how this looks in practice. And to preview the Joburg case, we see low embeddedness due to an explicit decision by the African National Congress government. This is the government of Nelson Mandela that fought for democracy. A decision by this government that its social movement allies should demobilize in order to not impede the capacity of government to implement. And then we see a growing incapacity of government to coordinate effectively in order to realize its programmatic orientation towards redistribution in housing and land use policy. And these outcomes are particularly surprising because the anti-apartheid movement in Joburg was in many ways much more powerful than the movement in Sao Paulo for democracy. The movement for Black political liberation and democracy in South Africa made housing and urban land a core mobilizing issue. After democratization in '94, the stated priority of the African National Congress was to use housing and land use policy to de-racialize cities like Johannesburg. So while the legacies of apartheid were likely to be strong, Joburg is a case where we have strong mobilization that combines both race and class, along with a dominant party alignment across local, provincial, and national government. So in Johannesburg, housing movements and neighborhood associations, which were allied to an independent trade union federation, united under the banner of the United Democratic Front, or UDF, in the 1980s. This is a poster from a rally that the UDF held in Johannesburg's Soweto Township in 1983. And at this rally, they were protesting what were then called community councils. These were unelected local authorities whose intentionally poor delivery outcomes produced one of the central demands of the UDF during the negotiations over the transition to democracy in '94, which was captured in the slogan, "One city, one tax base." And the idea of this demand was that in order to overcome the divides of apartheid urban development, richer white areas would cross-subsidize poorer Black areas through a central municipal property tax collection. And what you're looking at now is an official map of what the municipal governing arrangement that actually came out of these negotiations looked like. It's a bit confusing and fractured, and that's precisely the point. A critical compromise in the rushed negotiations before the first elections in '94 led to the institution of 4 municipal substructures that had strong powers, including the power to collect property taxes. So the power of municipal substructures became an attractive mechanism for traditional white elites, primarily property owners and property developers. They could not directly attack the legitimacy of redistributive policies of the central city government, which was focused on investing in housing and basic infrastructure in the Black townships. The role of racialization was particularly important for emphasizing the legitimacy of the new government. A Black majority had extremely high political legitimacy. So white elites pursued a more hidden route to undermine the capacity to actually implement those policies. They pursued a strategy of ring-fencing property tax contributions to the sub-municipal level through what were called city improvement districts. And one of the early examples of these city improvement districts was in Sandton, pictured here, which is often described in promotional documents of both the private and public sector as, quote, Africa's richest square mile. And this is a quote from an interview with the founder of the first city improvement district, who described to me what led her to make this kind of arrangement with her sub-municipal administrator. We definitely weren't going to give our contributions to the city because there would be no guarantee that it would be spent in our area. So we did a deal. There were 2 key factors in this strategy that left the local state without an embedded set of ties to civil society to effectively countervail the power of traditional white elites. First, you have the demobilization of largely Black housing movements in the townships. The rush to complete a negotiated democratic transition was coupled with a stated ideological belief of the ANC that the newly Black-led government would be charged with undoing the legacies of apartheid. And this was coupled with an explicit insistence on the demobilization of movements that had previously developed strong capacities to challenge government and hold it to account. And then secondly, we see how traditional white elites pursue a relatively hidden strategy to disable the capacity of the ANC government in Joburg to finance and deliver on its redistribution-oriented goals. So I've described so far how Joburg's lack of embeddedness helped produce low horizontal cohesion, which is the capacity to coordinate within the local government bureaucracy. But we can also see how it did not develop vertical cohesion. In housing and land use, the first reason for this is that national housing policy was to invest in subsidized housing production to be managed by provincial rather than local governments. And this helped create an incentive to develop low-income housing in the cheapest areas of the city, reproducing the traditional poor and Black peripheries of the city. We can see an example of such a project here. Despite this, the city tried to rein in private property developers who themselves were creating a new type of wealthy periphery in the northern parts of the city, further and further away from the sprawling Black townships of the south. The city did so by instituting what it called an urban development boundary. The idea was to prevent private development that would strain the financial resources of the city to build bulk infrastructure like roads and sewers to these new wealthy developments. But developers learned to venue shop by approaching provincial government as opposed to municipal government for building permits. And this allowed them to violate the city's urban development boundary. So I put a photo that I took of a number of development permits waiting judgment in the city of Johannesburg office. And when I met with a leading official in the Department of Land Use Management, she described this form of venue shopping. She said, referring to the private developers, these guys, they saw a loophole and then most applications were processed by province. Now they had powers to disregard any of our policies. So to sum up the Joburg case, we see weakening political and social support from local governments, base and movements to countervail the structural power of traditional white elites. These white elites organize and strategize around the color line to pursue hidden strategies to undermine redistribution-oriented reforms. And the result is a city government without capacity to regulate land in such a way that it can achieve its redistributive goals, like spatial transformation, or even more simply, enforcing an urban boundary. So if we go back to that 2x2, we can think about Joburg in this low embeddedness, low cohesion ideal type. Now to the Sao Paulo case. In Sao Paulo, the first mayoral term of the Workers' Party, or PT, was led by Mayor Luisa Erundina, who promised an inversion of priorities when she took office in 1989 in the city's budget to establish what was described as a PT way of governing. During this period, we see the beginning of embedded ties that would become more durable across subsequent governing regimes in the city. And in order for that to happen, this PT administration under Erundina had to create the space for movements to enter the bureaucratic sphere in local government. And this was uncomfortable even for a housing secretary like Herminia Maricatu, who was already quite well known as an advocate for poor people's housing in the city. She described to me what it was like when the mayor insisted that she must meet with housing movements when they asked for a meeting. She said, in that period, social movements would occupy our offices 1 week on, 1 week off. They always wanted to speak with us. My life wasn't easy because they were placing constant demands on our office. Now, Maricatu is a very senior official in the local bureaucracy, but the numbers of street level bureaucrats doubled in the housing department under Luisa Erundina, the mayor, going from 350 to 700. The approach to administration in this period was distributed across the geography of the city, including in the far peripheries, home to most of Sao Paulo's slums. These projects primarily focused on self-built housing projects called mutirão. You can see a photo from the beginning of one of those projects under the Erundina administration. And it was through these projects that not only was the city able to begin providing housing, but it was also able to begin extending sanitation services. So one of the street level bureaucrats during this period described to me what this kind of work was like. He said, the difference, I think, was the capillary nature of policy. You had technical officials in different parts of the city who worked directly with the people. The people were their primary reference point, and they were always near a housing project. This was the embryo of what we called local government. So these experiences of embeddedness created a base for subsequently developing broader cohesion as national policy began to empower local government to act. Beginning in the 2000s, the federal government developed policy instruments that could help cities integrate line agencies, especially planning, housing, and sanitation. And these laws emerged from demands that had first been made by housing movements in the 90s. So the Federal City Statute of 2001 established a legal framework for Sao Paulo's first master plan during the democratic era. This was the first master plan of any major city in the country in the democratic era, and it designated what are called zones of special social interest, which made it possible to upgrade slums without finalizing individual land title. This municipal innovation drew on the federal constitution's provision for what's called a social function of property and amounted to an assertion of the public right to relativize private property. Participatory Municipal Housing Council, established in 2002 under the same city statute, provided a framework for joint deliberation by housing movements and property developers in developing zoning and housing policies. So in addition to the deepening embeddedness of the local state in the movement sphere, which helped to countervail the power of business elites in the city, we see a growing horizontal cohesion within the bureaucracy. Many of the personnel who first entered government under Erundina persisted in subsequent administrations within the bureaucracy and spread out not only in the housing department, but also in planning, land use, and sanitation, all of which are located in this Marcinelli building. Let's picture it. We might think of this building as having become a physical representation of this horizontal cohesion. The proliferation of these bureaucrats with ties to and experiences with housing movements across departments in the building created a more networked set of ties across key departments for coordinating residential slum upgrading. And this circulation of bureaucrats, which has been confirmed by recent work in Brazil on networks of municipal officials, is a key form of horizontal cohesion that I find is precipitated through embeddedness. So federal law continued to empower Sao Paulo's local government. And this is a form of vertical cohesion, federal law empowering local government. The passage of the National Sanitation Law in 2007 empowered city governments to ensure that state-level sanitation companies responded to municipal priorities. And this is a photo of the Guarapiranga Reserve in the south of the city, which is one of the most difficult areas of the city to service with sanitation due to its proximity to water. But after the passage of this law, a center-right local administration made its upgrading a priority. And it was able to do so in part through the application of the zone of special social interest provision in the city's master plan. So the housing secretary under center-right administrations in the late 2000s and early 2010s described the pressure that pushed her office to work on these Guarapiranga upgrading projects. She said to me, "In Sao Paulo, we have serious movements. They have histories and representativity, and they should exist, no? They're always there fighting, and public authorities are sometimes struggling to keep up with them." So this was a period where embeddedness of the local state in the sphere of housing movements went hand in hand in pushing even center-right governments to maintain a project of cohesive institution building to deliver. So this is a study of two cities in a particular period in their political evolution. And in relative terms, we can see how these two cities fit in the conceptual space that I've presented here. And in the larger project, I leverage my work across policy arenas in housing, sanitation, and transportation to also explain why these configurations can change over time, even within a given city. So to wrap up, I began by asking, why are some cities more effective than others in reducing inequalities? It's about both the ties of the local state to civil society and the internal dynamics of coordinating local government action. And I'm suggesting that embeddedness does not necessarily undercut cohesion or vice versa, but that they can actually be mutually reinforcing. And today I've traced these dynamics across time in 2 cities, Johannesburg and Sao Paulo. We also want to know how this kind of approach might work with different cases around the world. In the book, I suggest a range of cases that we might use to see how far this approach to institutional dimensions of distributive politics in cities can travel. And I'm happy to talk about this more in the discussion, but I want to at least whet your appetite on that score. And I want to end by suggesting a couple lessons for how this work helps us understand the relationship of urban governing regimes to inequality. Variation in the coordination of power to distribute is at the core of how this work contributes to a new global urban sociology. So we want to first bring institutions back into how we think about the sources of urban inequalities. And we want to bring the city back into how we think about institutional change and the reproduction of inequality. It's this variation of urban institutions that will go a long way towards explaining the inequalities that will characterize humanity's urban future. So thanks very much. I'm really looking forward to what Alisha has to say and the questions and comments from all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. That was a wonderful presentation and very clear. So given that I'm giving these comments on the fly, obviously there are many things where I'm going to mainly just push for more clarification and also try to open up the discussion. But first, let me just say this is a hugely important topic, and I think Ben has put his finger on a great puzzle, which is why some cities are more effective at reducing inequality than others. And it's also really nice to see what we might think of as a sort of state and society approach applied to understanding city politics and really how city governments are interacting with social movements and embedding themselves. I'm a political scientist, so I'm always thrilled to hear, work that also brings institutions in. And as someone who studies cities, I think it's also wonderful to see work that's really nailing down how these institutions work and differ in practice. So your project is telling us a lot about that. So just a few themes that I'd love to hear more about. So first, you begin with the sort of traditional, these are core periphery cities. But as we know from the work of people like Teresa Cadera, these cities also are changing tremendously with the growth of gated communities and suburbs. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about the role that those gated communities and suburban housing associations are playing in both the cities. You mentioned them sort of briefly, that there's this covert mobilization in Johannesburg, but I'd love to hear how in Sao Paulo, authorities were actually able to potentially tamp down on some of that covert mobilization that I imagine share similar interests. So, are these gated communities taking similar forms in the two cities? And then how does a city government in Sao Paulo actually potentially control mobilization by those organizations? Or I should say, limit their impacts on inequality in the city. I'd also love to hear a little bit more about the role that national governments play in these two cases, given that public housing policies in particular often receive tremendous national attention and funding. And, I only follow the Brazilian case really, in the periphery, but, when you hear these announcements about Minha Casa, Minha Vida, it sounded very similar to the kind of South African attempts to really build new houses. It seemed like you had a similar coalition of major construction chambers and companies that would prefer to build housing rather than upgrade it. And so I'm curious how that national housing policy interacts with the sort of slum upgrading policies. Now, one answer really has to do with the land endowments of the cities. So, you see in large cities, oftentimes there simply isn't the land to think of doing these policies, especially within municipal boundaries. But I want to hear more about how national policy plays into these cases. These also are both cases with really important constitutional courts. I don't know, again, the Brazilian and South African jurisprudence, but I would love to hear a little bit more about, were there important decisions that actually came from the constitutional courts in terms of how upgrading was going to proceed, or likewise the way that housing policy was or wasn't possible in these two cases. Another theme that I'd just love to know more about really has to do with planning institutions and where you see the sort of critical junctures coming in the way that planning and, this horizontal cohesion, let's call it in particular, plays out in the cities. So my question really is, were these choices made at the democratic transition, or do they come from much longer traditions of development planning and urban planning? So you emphasize things like, the Federal City Statute of 2001, but when I think of Brazilian urbanism, at least in the context of Latin America, it has a pretty long urban planning tradition. It has a really strong legacy still, I'd say, of developmental state planning. And, I ask this also because I work in Colombia, where I see the history of planning from the 1960s still really shaping how cities are managed and also how the national government thinks about planning. I know nothing about South Africa, so I'm curious, is there a different planning tradition, either in terms of urban planning or developmental state planning, that maybe make some of these horizontal cohesion factors much more difficult? Or again, is this really a set of choices that are made at the moment of democratization in terms of institutional design and institutional form, and we should think much more about factors like the decentralization of the city, as opposed to these kind of bureaucratic legacies that might come from a much longer tradition of training planners and thinking of what planning means in the context of a developing economy. I also would love to know how far you would take your critique of decentralization. So it seems like you were hinting at, Johannesburg in some ways, particularly in its decision to decentralize taxes to the sub-city level, creates a very unequal resource base that probably is at the heart of a lot of other service inequalities. Sao Paulo, as I understand it, remains much more centralized in its fiscal approach, allowing for what you might consider to be, greater resource base to actually redistribute resources and services. So within this project, I'd love to hear you kind of maybe give, if this is where you're going, an even more forceful critique of decentralization. Obviously, when you come to social movements, the social movements have to be incorporated in a way that takes account of their local context. But I'm wondering, in terms of city government, should we take cohesion to mean also a formal institutional approach that actually centralizes resources more in the city? Mm-hmm. The last question that I'll throw out there really has to do with extending the story of what happens to these movements. And housing movements in particular. Paul Dosh has this interesting book, Demanding the Land, about Peru, which is really about how the fact that most informal housing movements end up demobilizing once they have basic title security and services. And the sort of paradox is that success often leads citizens to see little reason to continue to participate in politics. And so I'm curious, have we seen a similar story in Sao Paulo, where actually the extension of services and titles has weakened the movements? Or is this really a story potentially more in, the James Holston tradition of really seeing these movements then extend their own mobilization into broader claims of citizenship, other areas of service provision, continued involvement in political parties. So I'm wondering how you would see those legacies playing out once the immediate demands around housing, not that they're totally met, but perhaps the greatest insecurities have been addressed in Sao Paulo in a way that they haven't in Johannesburg. So again, I think this is a wonderful project, and these questions are really meant just to push us a little farther to hear more about this incredible research that you've done, and just clarifying the role of these gated communities, a little more on the planning legacies and the national government and courts involvement, I think would be fascinating. So thanks for sharing, Ben.
Yes, thank you, Ben, and thank you, Alisha. So Alisha has already put you in the nearly impossible position of even touching on so many, important and rich questions. Do you want me to add more questions now, or do you want to respond first? We have a number coming in through the Q&A. I have some of my own.
I'm happy to do either. I can try to answer Alicia's questions as quickly as possible. I'll try to combine my answers to some of them, but I'm happy for you to go too, so it's up to you.
You know, it's the Latin America style is like a bunch of people ask questions, and then I don't know which the South African style is.
It's also like
okay. So I'll throw some more, and some of them echo Alicia's too, and of course with the understanding that we all know you really won't have time to address many of these with significant depth. So I have 5 questions, which I'll ask very briefly, and they're somewhat discrete. So one is, by these set of criteria for inequality reduction and distribution of public goods, how does the evolution of these 2 cities in this time frame fare in comparison to other cities in Brazil and South Africa, right? And then I'm wondering if part of the story, besides, Alisha already introduced other spheres of governance, but more particularly, I wanted to hear you on the mismatches between scales of governance and jurisdiction contained within municipal boundaries, and then scales of cities as lived spaces, economies, cultures, and so on that don't end at municipal boundaries, right? In other words, what happens when you consider the metropolitan regions versus the municipalities, right? When you showed the map of São Paulo, of course, the dynamic you described intensifies once you consider surrounding municipalities, right? Where poverty and lack of infrastructure is even more pronounced in the metropolitan peripheries. There's a somewhat related question that goes in a different direction, which is, what's the role of individuals in these stories? What does your analysis do with the argument of Mayor Luiza Erundina as a rather exceptional figure in São Paulo and Brazil's political history, or at least arguably? So to the question of the role of political parties, which you touched on, and some of these differences of ANC party alignment, and then a very different picture in São Paulo, I was wondering about the relationship between unions and parties and how they play themselves out differently. And someone asked a more particular question about whether your research included interviewing anyone not directly or indirectly related to the ANC government in Johannesburg. And then a follow-up about the fundamental changes in policy that the ANC made after the 2000 re-election. Okay, so that's question sort of 3, somewhat discrete. The other, which is a different talk in and of itself, of course, is, but I want to ask this in its relationship to housing, which is the focus of today's talk, but transportation, particularly BRT, which is significant in both cities. And then 5th, or whatever this is, but
what's the question about BRT?
It's just how that plays into but particularly the relationship between transit and housing, just because if, I don't want to open up too much either, because, we feel for you, Ben, and this is, of course, your own fault for giving such a great talk. And by the way, I should say, I think it's the ways in which you're bridging and bringing together discussions that share questions and objects, but too often happen in parallel between the urban literature and political science, is just really important and stupendous. So thank you for the talk and for your work. So the last question, in a way, refers to 2 places where I think some of these divisions are perhaps not as pronounced as in US universities. And it's a question about South-South exchanges. I'm thinking of how certain South African scholars that are very involved in policy discussions now, like Edgar Peterson, for example, and arguments like learning from standardization of building materials in Latin America to incentivize upgrades and consolidation in South Africa. self-built precarious housing settlements and so on and so forth. So beyond the comparative aspect, is there a connective element to your book and to the research as well? Do you want more? There are more coming.
I defer to the authority of the moderator, but
no, please.
I'm also happy to. I'm happy to do it either way.
No, please. We'll give you some time, and then I'll organize the other questions coming in.
Okay, so I can't thank Alisha and Bruno and all the questioners who I didn't see who they were, but thank you all for these incredible questions. I mean, a lot of really rich things to think about. I'm going to try to answer as many of them as I can, as quickly as I can. So the question that Alisha raises about the increasing breakdown, we could say, of the strict core periphery dynamic. That's definitely a key issue. In some ways, in Sao Paulo, what helps is that breakdown is it's commensurate with an improvement in informal areas, such that you end up with more of a patchwork that is in which the boundaries between the informal and the formal are actually not as hard as they once were. In contrast, in Joburg, the growth of these same types of communities and suburbs spatially is still more separated, and in a way is producing a new additional wealthy periphery, whereas the kinds of things that Caldeira is looking at, these are gated communities with their own kinds of dysfunctions that she gets at quite evocatively, but much closer to informal areas. And in that sense, service provision to rich and poor areas is not necessarily so much of a spatial competition. In terms of the role of national governments, how the national housing subsidy policy is crucial. Part of this is just a matter of timing in comparing the two countries. Minha Casa Minha Vida, the Brazilian housing subsidy program, was passed in 2009, whereas in South Africa, the equivalent program that in many ways was arguably an inspiration for the Brazilian program began soon after the first elections in 1994, and most of the actual building, or the pace of building, was much faster in the 90s than in the 2000s. And so you have, there's a certain kind of path dependency that this generates in South Africa, where the national government's housing subsidy program is seen as the dominant form of housing policy in terms of getting the top structure house, whereas in Brazil, you have a lot more time to develop for municipalities to produce their own kind of local policy regimes around slum upgrading that can actually take root on the ground. This kind of gets to Alisha's questions about planning institutions and their legacies that might be separate from the kind of conjunctural moment of democratization. And there's definitely something to that, as Alisha rightly suggests. What I would say is that municipal government, in the Brazilian case and in the South African case, or rather in the Sao Paulo case and the Joburg case, municipal government is not the key actor there. So there are definitely strong traditions of slum upgrading projects and housing projects, but it was democratization that made it possible for municipal governments to adopt those legacies and build that into a local government policy regime. And in fact, we see quite variable, even within Brazilian cities, we see quite variable histories of whether they're adopting those legacies into the local policy regime or not. So in fact, the role of decentralization to the municipal scale in the constitutional dispensation is quite important there. And this also gets to the question around too much decentralization. So it's definitely true that the sub-municipal decentralization in the Joburg case produced some dysfunctional outcomes. As one of the questioners, I think, is alluding to, I should mention that this sub-municipal arrangement was ended in a reorganization of the city in 2000 in Johannesburg. And after which, it's not the ring fencing that becomes so important, but rather the venue shopping dynamic of going for development approvals to the province instead of the local government that takes over in the story that I find in Joburg. This also speaks to the question that Bruno raises around metropolitan urbanization and also metropolitan governance. And one of the key dilemmas that both policymakers and politicians and activists all face in both Sao Paulo and Johannesburg now is that it is in fact true that the extent of urbanization is at the metropolitan scale and is not contained within the municipal scale. And there's no effective institutional arrangement in either context that really can produce governing outcomes that can plan at that scale. So that's definitely a kind of forward-looking, that's one of the key dilemmas of institution building for urban planning and related fields, at least. I want to just speak briefly about the question that Alisha raised regarding demobilization of movements, because this is absolutely a critical question. And it's true, Sao Paulo sounds like a positive case. I am describing a lot of mobilization, but I should be clear. There are multiple generations of movements in Sao Paulo. And in fact, each generation exhibits the kinds of dynamics that Alisha suggests, where once they start securing wins in their own neighborhood, they do begin to bureaucratize and demobilize and lose a lot of their political power. But each generation of movements has continued to be organized not only at the neighborhood level, but at the city scale. And it's that capacity to continue to be organized at the city scale means that the kinds of demands that movements make are not only about securing particularistic benefits for their neighborhood or for their residents, but remain pitched at a programmatic level about policy change at the municipal scale, at least. So we're not dealing with the metropolitan question, but we are dealing with a relatively large scale for movement organization. The key issue in Johannesburg is that there was an early demobilization of citywide movement organization. And there's a lot of protest that happens in Johannesburg. Some people call Johannesburg in South Africa the protest capital of the world because of the extent of protest around public goods distribution. But all of the protest, almost without exception, is organized at the neighborhood or even lower scale. Okay, I want to get to some of these other questions. So Bruno, I talked about the municipal boundaries, but you also asked about the role of individuals. I think there's something to be said that Luis Erundina is a particularly unique figure. But within the history of the PT in Sao Paulo, this is kind of getting into the weeds, but it's a Brazil seminar, so I feel okay. Within the history of the PT in Sao Paulo, she represented a tendency within the Sao Paulo PT. And when I interviewed a lot of her cabinet, and I was lucky to interview them because some of them have actually died in the intervening years, they saw themselves as part of a tendency, and they were part of a group that had a position. For those who are aware of the intricacies of intra-PT dynamics, they were very against Lula's tendency within the PT and his chosen candidate in Sao Paulo. So there's an organizational dimension there. It's also important, I think, that in the most recent municipal election in Sao Paulo, you had a leader of the newest generation of housing movements in the city in the second round of the mayoral election, running with Erundina as at the bottom of his ticket. So you had this kind of allusion, at least, to the sense that there's been a programmatic content of left housing politics that's persisted across 30 years in Sao Paulo's political history. Did I interview non-ANC people in Joburg? I did. There were some key bureaucrats who were previously city councilors from the Democratic Alliance, which has historically been the opposition party and briefly was in power in Johannesburg. But the story in Joburg, at least in the time period that I was looking at, the ANC was in power the entire time. So it's largely dominated by the ANC. And I'll stop here and I'll get to the transit and housing question in the next round.
We'll let you breathe. So let me collect a few other questions that were posed by attendees to add to the mix. One more theoretical by Diana Midland, who wants to know whether you've problematized the ideas of embeddedness and coherence. And she writes, surely there's a question, the nature and quality of embeddedness and coherence, in addition to the amount of embeddedness and coherence. And I'll add to that, whether you could speak speculatively on another change, basically the internet and its role in changing the questions you're interested in.
Did you say the internet?
Yes, yeah. Questions about embeddedness and especially the mobilizational dimensions you've spoken of. Do you want to just take that one, or should I add?
Yeah, I can take that, and then I'll pick up the ones that I missed in the previous round. So I absolutely agree. This is not like a purely quantifiable thing, either embeddedness or cohesion, though I wanted to present some kind of quantifiable dimensions, at least for kind of conceptual tractability. But a lot of it is really about the quality of the interaction. And something that I really emphasize is that this has to speak to a programmatic policy content. When you see policy impact, it's not just about how many times a movement is meeting with a municipal government, or how many deals are secured for any given neighborhood for which there are activists who meet with the government. It's about, is there a citywide policy dynamic and citywide policy implementation dynamic that one can identify as being changed through these factors of embeddedness and cohesion. The role of the internet is an interesting one that I don't know as much, but I guess I subscribe to some of the skepticism around the role of the internet in being a unique generator of impactful organization, and that it can bring people to the street, but there's a much deeper, more substantive kind of organizational practice that has to be developed beyond the virtual space that often generates the kinds of dynamics of embeddedness and cohesion that I'm trying to pinpoint in terms of generating institutional change. I just want to talk about the transit question because it also speaks to the South-South exchange issue. And that's because, Sao Paulo is not the obvious case from Latin America to talk about reform and transportation policy. The key Colombian cities, Curitiba in Brazil, are much more famous for their bus rapid transit innovations. But what I found was, and what happened in Joburg is actually, it was people from, there was actually a key trip of Joburg officials to Colombia to basically sell the BRT vision that led to an emphasis on bus rapid transit in Joburg that largely ignored the existing informal minibus taxi operators. And what we have in Joburg is basically BRT is used by very few people. The dominant mode of collective transportation remains minibus taxis, but all of the public investment has gone into the BRT. In contrast, in Sao Paulo, the story that I tell is that actually it was much more of an institutional reform as opposed to introducing a new technology like BRT. And it was much more focused on building relationships with existing operators, both formal and informal, in order to build a single, integrated, and much more extensive collective transportation system for the dominant mode of transportation, which is buses.
Great. You ready for another round? So Isadora, and apologies for being unable to pronounce names correctly. Isadora Kruxing asks a question that I think echoes one of Alisha's earlier ones, but takes in a different direction. And the question is, could you tell us a little bit about the elites in São Paulo and how they shaped municipal policy? And she's thinking of the master plan in particular and how it protects high-income neighborhoods. And she mentions the Jardins, which is sort of a garden city modeled early 20th century, very horizontal and very elite neighborhood. But that, protected those high-income neighborhoods from verticalizing, right? Pushing people away from the center. And I'll also add Alejandro Velasco's question, which is about the weight of apartheid, anti-apartheid in configuring political horizons in South Africa, and how that factors into how state embeddedness in civil society works in ways that might account for the differences you mentioned. And still quoting, in other words, knowing very little about South Africa, but a little more about São Paulo, it seems that preceding political contexts before and during your case studies are different enough to complicate a comparison of strategy differences alone. A very important question too, I think.
Both are great. I mean, this is an incredible range of questions. So first, the question about elites in Sao Paulo. I don't want to sound like elites don't matter in Sao Paulo, because anybody who has been in Sao Paulo for just a couple of days can see that the power of elites is very strong in Sao Paulo. And, like when I went to meetings in municipal offices, I often saw developers who I had interviewed separately walking in and out of the building. Like there's a strong set of connections with especially developers, but also these kind of neighborhood associations, wealthy neighborhood associations. And in a way, that's not surprising. That's the dominant model of urban development in most places in the world. What's surprising is when they're able to be countervailed. So yes, it's true. There are these wealthy central neighborhoods in Sao Paulo that have basically acted with kind of classic, not in my backyard type approaches. But at the same time, you see other provisions in a master plan that begin to relativize private property and actually allow the city to take buildings in other parts of the center of the city for low-income housing, to upgrade informal settlements before there's full individual land title. So what I'm concerned with here is not that elite power is overturned in one of the largest and most capital-driven cities in the world, but rather that there's a countervailing power that is evident and makes a real difference. Then in terms of the question about the weight of the anti-apartheid movement in configuring political horizons, and I think that was the way it was articulated, and I like that articulation. I think that's right, but it configured political horizons in a way that definitely were not appreciated at the time, and in some ways should still be surprising. So first, the role of combining both race and class and democratization meant that you can think of almost no government coming out of a peaceful democratic transition, which maybe some people might argue that's an issue, but no government with this strong political legitimacy to pursue a redistributive agenda. The way that so that's what led many observers to say, well, South Africa probably has a better chance than Brazil in some ways because of this combination of race and class. Whereas in Brazil, the race issue is there, but it wasn't thematized in the same way in the struggle for democracy nearly at all. The way that instead we see the anti-apartheid movement configuring political horizons for a place like Joburg in practice is in the kind of organization that the ANC is, and in particular in its orientation towards highly centralized and in some quarters of the party, quite explicitly Leninist, vanguardist approaches to how the party should relate to movements. So there's this tension in the ANC, whether it's a mass-led party that is kind of in a co-governing arrangement with unions and social movements, or whether it's much more of a vanguard party. And it's those internal dynamics and the way that those were settled that I think produced that political horizon much more than you could say that, say, the racial basis of apartheid made subsequent unequal outcomes inevitable, because in fact it was the racial basis of apartheid that arguably should have made South Africa more likely to be positive and Joburg to be more likely to be positive.
No, yeah, thanks, Ben. I think we have time for one more question. I should apologize for attributing a question by Livio Müller to Isadora. Livio had asked about São Paulo elites. I'll now ask Isadora's two questions, which I think are a great way to end what's been an extremely stimulating conversation, and I will read them. Isadora writes, well, first she writes, Ben, thank you for a great presentation. I have been cutting those off from the questions, but you should know that attendees have expressed their praise. So Isadora asks, you presented the framework as categories that apply to cities as opposed to particular governments, though I imagine embeddedness and cohesiveness are not static but mutable. Different governments may build coordination capacity or reduce capacity through privatization, for example. They may also be more embedded in broader civil society or in business. How do you treat this potential dynamism? How sticky are regimes over time? I think a very important question too. And then the second part of that is, I think, connects to our earlier discussions about the sort of a mismatch of scales. But this one actually expand the scales beyond the region, but doesn't quite get to the national. And I now quote, these are cities that you'd consider as cities on the map. They receive a lot of attention, they have more resources. What about other cities? Thinking, for example, of the case of sanitation. Sabesp, and Sabesp is the Brazilian water and waste management company at the state level in São Paulo. Sabesp may be more responsive to the São Paulo city government as its largest consumer base, but there are greater documented power asymmetries between the company and other cities. How might your framework travel to cities off the map?
Those are both great. So in terms of how sticky are regimes over time, that's something that I was really concerned with in this study, and I totally flattened in this presentation, primarily just for the sake of time, but also to show that there is an important cross-sectional difference between the two cities. But something I do in the book is to trace exactly how these cities actually can travel through this conceptual space and in different ways. And it all depends on the configurations over time. So what I'm interested in there is showing, well, embeddedness can build cohesion at a certain point, say in housing policy in Sao Paulo. But cohesion is in some ways stickier than embeddedness. And that's where the mobilization problem does come in. And in some ways, cohesion can breed a certain kind of overconfidence amongst urban administrators, even from the left. I show in the PT that actually the administration of Fernando Haddad, who was the last PT mayor, his term was 2013 to 16, was actually much less connected to housing movements than prior PT administrations. And in that sense, he lost a lot of the embeddedness that had allowed prior PT administrations to build that cohesive capacity within the local government. So in a way, one might say that this was kind of prefiguring some of the broader shifts that were happening not only in Sao Paulo, but Brazil nationally. But my approach to it is that this requires an empirical specification, which is to look at the historical data and say, like, this needs to be periodized, precisely because these aren't inherently sticky, and we need to understand what are the dynamics of change for why they are sticky sometimes and why they aren't at others. And then in terms of the responsiveness of the state sanitation company to Sao Paulo compared to other cities, I think it's a great point. I think that there's a lot more capacity in Sao Paulo. In fact, even in Sao Paulo, some will debate how much capacity there was to really enforce responsiveness of Sabesp, but over time it was able to build that capacity from an existing base that, as he says, saying does not exist in a lot of other cities in Sao Paulo state. Yeah, so I think Sao Paulo in that sense is an exception within its own state, for sure. But the fact is it didn't have that capacity to make Sabesp to be as responsive 10, 15 years ago as it does today.
Yeah. So, Alisha, do you have any, I think we are coming to the end of our time, but do you have any follow-ups, any last?
I would really just thank Ben. I think you did a very thorough job answering the questions, and honestly, it just revealed what a tremendously rich project this is, and the many dimensions that we obviously didn't see today, including comparisons with transit and sanitation. And I think it's going to make for a fabulous book project. So I'm very excited, and I would just say, also I think the book will allow you to bring out some of these temporal questions about. There seems like there's a sequencing argument that's really important, that you actually need these sorts of, this sort of embeddedness is very important at the transition in particular, when questions about upgrading are potentially most central. And so the story of kind of later national housing policy choices, really depends on when those choices are made. So I really liked that answer, and I'd love to see in the final project, even more attention to that temporality of how these choices are sequenced. So thank you. I thought it was a tremendous discussion and great questions as well.
Completely agree. Ben, how far into the present does the book go?
It ends at 2016, which is convenient for a number of political reasons. In Brazil, obviously, kind of politics really started going haywire in 2016, but also at the local level, it's the end of a mayoral administration. And then in Johannesburg, 2016 is the year that the ANC first lost power at the local level. So in both cities, it makes sense to leave it there. And there are a whole range of other political complications that arise after that.
Is there a prologue to the book that tries to at least pry open some of the more recent developments?
Prologue, or right now?
Sorry. Epilogue, yeah.
Yeah, it's coming at the end.
I meant, So since I voiced the questions of attendees, I'll also, applaud on their behalf. This was really great. Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you so much, Alisha, for the wonderful comments and questions. And thank you all for sticking around, for submitting your questions, and for listening. As you've heard, this will be available online on YouTube very soon. And we all look forward to your book, Ben.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for all of the questions. This was fantastic.
Thank you for giving me a chance to discuss.